Of course, there's lots about commercial awareness on LawCareersNet. We've got our commercial awareness page, sponsored by Kirkland & Ellis, and of course every week we have a law firm writing our commercial question, which is a feature that appears both on the site and on the LawCareersNet weekly newsletter. Have a look, keep learning, keep reading, and your commercial knowledge will blossom. So today I'm going to do a little bit of a commercial awareness case study for you. You've probably been reading about the fact that President Trump is talking to China again about their ongoing trade war. You'll recall that back in July 2018, the Americans and the Chinese slapped like-for-like trade tariffs, 25% on a number of items that they were exporting to each other. These were going to be import tariffs, and the idea was to really hurt the opposite country's economy. As we probably are aware, trade wars rarely end well, but what I want to do is just delve in a bit more deeply into the effects of this on a particular sector. And the one I've chosen here is soybeans, the US soybean market. Now China has always been a really crucial market for American soybean farmers. Traditionally the Chinese market take about 60% of their output. This was something that grew in the 1980s really, when the Chinese, who are the most enthusiastic consumers of pigs in the world, were convinced by the American soybean lobby that they could fatten their pigs a lot more quickly if they used the US soybeans. So we went from having about 30,000 tonnes of soybeans in 1982 up to 95 million tonnes of soybeans in 2017 being exported from the US to China. The effect of the tariffs was almost immediate. Of course, with the 25% import tariff on the American soybeans, the cost of those rose massively. So what was actually the on-the-ground impact? So let's first of all look at the US. Well, these tariffs were slapped on in July 2018. That was after the farmers had all actually done their planting. They didn't have to plant soybeans, but they thought they had a guaranteed market from China. As it turns out, all of a sudden they were going to have serious difficulty in exporting those beans. They were going to have to look elsewhere. So what happened? Well, the price dropped, obviously, if you've got less demand, because the Chinese aren't buying so much, because for them the price is very high. For everybody else, the price became lower. So what you actually saw was an increase in exports to places like the EU, who suddenly found that US soybeans were fairly cheap. In fact, you even saw an increase into places like Argentina, which is actually a soybean producing country itself. Because of course, on the other hand of things, the Chinese were looking for other places to buy soybeans from which didn't have a tariff on them, which included South America. The other thing that happened was that the American government offered one-off subsidies to the soybean industry in order to try and mitigate some of those losses that had been caused by the tariff war. But what that meant was that ultimately the demand was massively reduced, and as we sit now, despite some recent softening of the position, the American soybean industry is looking at a massive glut of production, and they've actually got lots in storage that they're looking for a home for. So let's look to the other side now. What happened in China? Well, as I mentioned before, they produce an awful lot of hogs, and they traditionally use the American soybeans to feed these hogs, and actually they had a standard regulation where you had to use 20% protein in your hog feed in order to feed your pigs correctly. Now, what happened was a number of things. First of all, as I said before, they started looking to other markets to buy soybeans, so South America was probably the biggest one there. The other thing they did was they actually changed the regulations for what they had to feed hogs. It transpires actually that the soybean industry had been so cunning in their marketing back in the 80s that the 20% limit turned out actually not to be really necessary, and they've actually dropped that to about 12%. There was also an outlier event, which was there was an outbreak of swine flu in China, which led to a 10% or so slaughter of their stocks as well, which combined means that you've lost an awful lot of demand for your soybeans. So basically China has made itself less reliant on soybeans. Now they've also actually modified in many cases the way in which they organise their feeding. So the upshot is that probably that demand that we saw before the tariff war is never going to return, which is going to be to the detriment of the US soybean industry. So what's happened as a result of this? Well, in the States, Smaller farmers who have been in the soy industry for years are actually having to sell up. They just can't make it pay anymore. What that means in turn is that some of that agricultural land will probably be bought up by bigger agricultural conglomerates. They've got greater economies of scale. They can spread the use of their machinery over a larger number of acres. So that's seeing perhaps a change in the ownership of the US farm. You're going to see more power concentrated in a smaller number of agricultural hands. In China, what you're seeing is, as I said before, a modification on how they actually organise their feeding of their hogs, so they don't need so much soy. They're also going to be probably investing in places like Brazil to add in the infrastructure that allows more efficient export of soy from from Brazil, Argentina, and those sort of countries, the kind of infrastructure that already existed between China and America. So what that means again is that's detrimental in the long term to American trade, because the Americans are now competing with a more efficient trading competitor in the form of the South Americans. So that again is bad news for America in the longer term. So finally, what do we think is going to be happening in the future? Well, at the moment, the Americans and the Chinese are talking about doing a deal. Potentially, they may be getting rid of those tariffs. We don't know. One thing that was announced last week was actually that the number of Chinese exports to the US has reached its highest ever, whereas the American exports to China, soybeans as we've talked about, but also automotive parts, and other commodities, oil, have actually dropped considerably. So if you're just looking on balance of trade type terms, this has probably been a big loss for the USA. There's going to be some thawing of this situation. In the soybean market, actually the Chinese have bought some soybeans. There was actually zero bought in November 18. It's risen since then, and there might be a relative return to previous situations, but certainly never to the previous historic levels. Indeed, one of the outcomes of that is that the soybean producers in Brazil might all of a sudden be in trouble, because of course during the trade war they planted a massive bumper crop of soybeans. Suddenly, if the American tap turns on again, if the tariffs disappear, they're going to be left holding the baby with far more soy than they can actually sell. So that could be actually detrimental to the Brazilian soybean market as well. So I think the key point to take away from all of this is looking at secondary and tertiary actions or results of initial actions. So you put on a tit for tat trade war. How does that actually push the buttons, all the different moving parts down the line across the globe? So when you're thinking commercially, that's the kind of place that you need to be going. You need to be saying, this leads to this, leads to this. What are actually the implications for all the different parties involved? Who's a winner, who's a loser, who's changed their behaviour, what's going to happen next? But really what you need to do is just start thinking about things, and having a conversation about them is really a key part of it. Test theories, chat about it, that's the way to do it. I didn't know anything about American soybean industry until this afternoon. I've researched this only in a couple of hours. That's all you need to be doing. Now I could go to the pub today and have a conversation about soybean prices. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to find anyone who wants to have it with me. But there you go. I hope you've enjoyed it.